Hey guys, in this video we're going to be looking at chapter 14 of the Ecce textbook titled Who's to Blame? And again we're going to return to our Roman family as their carriage is stuck in the ditch and they try to figure out what to do. The grammar for this chapter is really important because we're coming back to imperfect verbs. So we learned a little bit about the imperfect in the last chapter. Now we're going to learn the full information on what the endings are and how we form the imperfect. So to start, we want to look at the vocabulary, and again, we're going to be looking at derivatives. So the first word we want to look at is extraho extrahere, which means to drag out. And the English derivative that will help you with this is the word extract. And again, you want to think of extracting something as taking something out, or dragging it out. That's where we get this word for. Frustra means in vain in Latin, and in English we get words like frustrate or frustrated. So again, if you're frustrated at something, it means you're doing it in vain, it's not going anywhere. That's the root of this word. The word we have is movere, which means to move in Latin. And this gives us a few English derivatives that are all holding that similar meaning. So these include mobile, move, motion, motor, commotion, and locomotive. And at their core, all 6 of these are talking about movement. They might mean slightly different things, but that's the root. So a good derivative to know for this would be the word motion, because if you can remember that, you'll remember that this is a word of movement. And again, that idea of motion helps explain all 6 of these derivatives. They're all about moving. If you call someone mobile, it means they're able to move. And if you think of a motor, it's something that helps you move from one place to the next. That's the root of all 6 of these words. From culpa, which means blame, we get the English words culpable and culprit. And again, both of these have to do with blame. If you're culpable, it means you're to blame. And the culprit of something is the person we're going to blame. In English, a phrase we see often is actually straight from Latin, mea culpa, which means my fault or my blame is one way of thinking about it. But again, we're talking about fault or blame with this word. Placidē means peacefully. And in English, we get the words placid and placate, and you can see the roots still retained in their spelling. So if something is placid, it means it's very peaceful. And again, it has that same meaning as the Latin adverb here. The next word, noster, in Latin means hour, and a good way to remember this would be to draw upon any knowledge you have of the Romance languages. So if you've ever taken French or Italian or Spanish or even Romanian in this case, you should recognize that the word for hour in all 4 of these languages is coming from noster. It means the same thing, and you can see the spelling is retained pretty closely so that you could easily recognize it. Again, they're all coming back to this one Latin root. Dēvertēbat is a verb that is actually an imperfect, which we're going to be learning about in this chapter. But if you look at the definition of your book, they're using a translation that's he began to turn aside, which is another way of, using the imperfect. You could also just as easily say he was turning aside. But a good way to remember it in English is to think of the derivative divert. If you divert someone, it means you're pushing them off their path or away from their original path is one way to think about it. You're turning them aside. You could also think of a diversion. It's another derivative for this. But again, those 2 roots are coming back to the same word as dēvertēbat. It just happens that the spelling for this word is imperfect. So after this video, you'll understand why it's spelled this way. Periculum means danger in Latin, and in English we get the derivatives perilous, peril, and also imperil. And they're all holding on to that idea of something being dangerous, or there's danger. So if you call something perilous, it's another word for dangerous. All 3 of these are coming from this same Latin root. Ars artis means art or skill in Latin, and in English we get the derivatives artifact, artist, artifice, artificial, and artisan. And all 5 of these are holding on to that same meaning of someone who's skilled or someone who does art or does some particular skill. They're coming back to ars artis. Ago agere means to do or to drive in Latin. And in English, we get a few interesting derivatives from this that will help you remember the meaning. Those include agent, actor, agile, action, agitate, and active. All 6 of these have the same meaning of movement or doing something. So if you think of someone who's an agent, it means they put things in motion, they do things. The same goes for the word actor. An actor is someone who's moving across the stage. And again, active, agitate, they're all holding on to this same meaning. So if you can remember one of these derivatives, it will help you with the translation of ago, agere. This brings us to the grammar for chapter 14, which is the imperfect tense. And we're calling it part 2 here because we already had an introduction in the last chapter. In this chapter, though, we're going to go much more in depth, and we're going to look at how exactly we form it across all 4 conjugations and what our endings are. And at the end, we'll be coming back even to irregular verbs in the imperfect tense. So to start, we just want to have a quick recap of the present tense again. And remember, we said last chapter that all the verbs we've seen so far have been in the present tense. And the present tense is used to describe actions that are taking place at this time of the story, meaning they're happening right now. And if you think back, we've made our list and our chart of the 4 conjugations and all the verb endings that go with them. So you want to keep this in the back of your mind as we move through chapter 14. So to form the imperfect tense in Latin, we're going to be using the same rules that we had for making the present tense. The difference, though, is that we're going to be inserting that BA infix that we talked about last chapter in front of the personal verb endings, and you'll see exactly what I mean in a second. So for instance, if we take the verb laudo laudare, which means to praise, we learn that the way we form the present tense and get the present stem is by taking the infinitive and dropping the RE. If you do this, you get lauda. That's our present stem. And if we add the endings, the verb endings that we already know, you can conjugate this verb into laudo, laudas, laudat, and so on. And again, we said we're taking that present stem of lauda and we're simply adding on our present tense endings, ost, mustisnt. The trick, though, in the imperfect is, again, we're inserting that BA infix. So if you look underneath, this is how we would write out laudo laudare in the imperfect. And again, you'll notice that BA has now been slipped in. That's our infix. Whenever you see that BA in a verb, you know we're talking about the imperfect tense. And in front of the BA infix, we have lauda. That's our present stem. So that's an important thing to note. The imperfect tense is still using the present stem. And again, if you look, once we have the present stem and that BA infix, we're simply adding on our personal verb endings, the ost, mustisnt. The only thing you want to note is that in the first person singular, we're substituting an M instead of the O. Other than that, it's following the same pattern and rules as forming the present tense. So again, here's a chart of our endings for the imperfect tense. We have bom, bos, bot, bomus, botus, bont. And again, all we're looking at here is that BA infix with our personal endings added on. These are the imperfect endings for all Latin verbs. The only ones that aren't here are the irregulars, which we're going to see in a little bit in this video. But what this means is that if you memorize these simple endings, you'll be all set. Whatever Latin verb you come across, you'll be able to put it into the imperfect tense because they're all using these endings. And again, the trick to it is you have that BA in, and it's followed by our personal verb endings. And again, the one note I mentioned before is that first person singular. Instead of an O, we've substituted an M. This is important because you're going to see it in a couple other tenses when you move through Latin, so don't get thrown off by this M. The last thing you want to note about these endings is take a quick look at where the long marks are. In the second person singular, and then the first and second person plural, it's a long A. This is important. You're going to see this a lot in Latin endings. It's always a long vowel in these 3 spots. So let's compare our 2 tenses. On the top we have the imperfect, and down below we have the present. So again, all we've done is put in that BA infix. But you'll notice across the board they're sharing endings. So it's not too difficult to memorize the imperfect endings. If you know the present tense, you already know the imperfect. You're just adding in a BA. And again, that first person singular is where you really want to pay attention because it's slightly different. There's no O, you're adding the M. So just like when we were forming the present tense, remember, what you're doing is following some simple rules to get the imperfect. These rules are the same as the present. So first off, you find that present stem. And again, you go to the infinitive and drop the RE. Next, you add the imperfect infix, which is the BA. And you want to remember the A is long in those three specific spots we just mentioned. So remember that moving forward. The last thing you do is you add your personal verb endings, the OST, MUS, TISNT. And remember that O will actually be an M in the imperfect. So let's take a look at our chart again. This time we've put in the imperfect ending. So again, you want to take note. All four conjugations in the imperfect are using the present stem, and the way you get that stem is going to the infinitive and dropping the RE. So if we look at the first and second conjugations, parare and habere, we've just taken the infinitive, lose the RE, and you have para and habe. Those are the two present stems that we use for those first and second conjugation verbs. The one you want to look at though is third conjugation, and again you'll notice in mittere that E has been lengthened. So instead of a short E, it's MITT, and then there's a long E before the BAM. That's one thing to notice. And on the other side we have our third conjugation I stem, and notice that I has slipped in there, so it's yakiebam. There's an I before that long E. In the fourth conjugation we also want to take note. The stem would be AUDI if we go to audire and drop the RE. But again, look what happened in the imperfect. There's a long E that has slipped in there, so it's audiebam. So in this sense, the fourth conjugation is acting like a third conjugation IO. So you want to pay attention to that long E that's worked its way into the fourth conjugation imperfect ending. But again, across all four conjugations, that BA is going to be what gives away the imperfect tense. Whenever you see it, you know you're dealing with an imperfect. And again, in that first person singular, take note of the M. It's not an O there, there's always going to be an M. So just some quick notes. When you're putting third conjugation IO verbs into the imperfect tense, you need to add an I before the E. When you're putting fourth conjugation verbs into the imperfect tense, you need to add a long E to the stem and shorten the I. So again, look back at our chart for fourth conjugation. You shorten the I and you add that long E. When you're putting all third and fourth conjugation verbs into the imperfect tense, you need to make the E that's on the stem a long vowel. So look at that stem. Think of mittere in the last example we did. You have to lengthen the E. So just keep track of the long marks in your book. You should be fine, but it's good to know this so that you can anticipate it moving forward. So let's have an example. Ego et Marcus spectamus quicium, which means Marcus and I watched the quicium, which is a small carriage. So to turn this into the imperfect, we have to take our verb spectamus and we have to change it. And again, we're adding in that BA infix. So now we have Marcus and I were watching the quicium. That BA has made it imperfect, and we changed the way we translate it. So to do this, again, we're taking the infinitive of the verb, which in this case would be spectare. We're dropping the RE to get the present stem, and then we're adding that BA infix. Now the last step is we add our personal verb ending. When you put this all together, you get spectabamus, which means we were watching. This is how you form and use the imperfect. The next piece of grammar for this chapter is irregular verbs. And specifically, we're going to be looking at how they're formed in the present and imperfect tenses. So again, irregular verbs are ones that don't behave like most Latin verbs do. They don't fit into any of the four conjugations and they have slightly different endings. The two irregular verbs we've seen so far are esse, which means to be, and posse, which means to be able. So let's look at our chart here and we'll look at the present and imperfect endings for those two verbs. So in the present, what you want to notice is that the verb esse, which we memorized early on in the book, to make posse, we just add on the form of esse to this stem of pos. Posse is what's called a compound verb, and the reason it's called that is because we're basically combining two verbs together into one. The verb we're using here is actually esse, and you can notice by the endings. So in other words, for the first person singular, we're taking esse, which would be sum, I am, and to say I am able, we're taking that sum and just adding it to a stem of pos, pos. That's something you want to take note of. These two verbs are extremely close in spelling because they're borrowing each other's endings. Specifically, posse is borrowing the spelling from esse. And again, for posse, take note of this stem. It's either going to be a POS or a POT. So you want to memorize what the stem is for each person. So first person singular, first person plural, and third person plural, it's going to be POS. For all the others, it's POT. Just take a mental note of it. And again, for sum and esse, you'll notice that the endings match up with our present or imperfect endings. So there's the M, ST, MUS, TISNT. It's using the same endings we've been seeing the entire book. Now in the imperfect for esse, you want to take a note of the stem. It's really different, so you have to memorize this. There's no real trick for picking out this stem. You just want to memorize that it's ERA. So whenever you take esse and put it into the imperfect, you start with ERA and then you're adding your ending. So again, look at the imperfect of these two verbs. The imperfect of posse is just taking that stem of POT and adding on the imperfect of esse. So in other words, eram means I was. To say I was able, we take that eram and we put the stem of. So if you look, the imperfect of posse is that POT stem, and you'll notice this is the same for all 6 of our persons. And then after the POT, we're just adding the imperfect of esse. That's where you get pateram, pateras, paterat, and so on down the line. And again, just like we said before, pay attention to where those long vowels are. It'll be in the second person singular and then the first and second person plural. That A is going to be long. So just to recap, to form the imperfect of esse and posse, we follow these rules. For esse, you're going to take the imperfect stem of ERA and add the personal endings. And in this case, it's going to be MST, MUS, TISNT. You're just adding them right on. For posse, you're going to take the imperfect stem of POT and then you're going to add on the imperfect forms of esse. So in other words, you're going to be taking POT and adding eram, eras, erat. This is how you form posse in the imperfect. So again, there's some memorization you need to do in this chapter, but hopefully you'll notice it's actually simpler to break it down into these simple rules. You're taking endings from one verb and adding them to make a new one. That's all you're doing with esse and posse.